All right, episode 3, composition and staging designs continued. We're going to take a look at some more compositional design ideas, motifs, give you some examples again from the film Dr. Zhivago, directed by David Lean, and No Country for Old Men, continuing on the last episode, and taking a look at some more that we can practice and take a look at and see how we can use in our own work to tell stories. So the next one we're going to be looking at is Radiating Lines. Now this is one you've probably seen a lot. It's used quite a bit. Perspective lines are pretty strong in this one, and again using it to tell a story. So basic, simple breakdown, some kind of perspective lines, super simple. It could be trees. You've seen it in power lines, fences, roads, just all kinds of things that can direct our attention to a focal point somewhere here. Doesn't have to be in the center, preferably in, of course we talked about the thirds, but as you look at this frame, completely broken, right? Straight down the center. We've said, oh, we can't do that, you can't ever put anything directly in the center. And here's a master right here, David Lean, using it in combination with another one we're going to take a look at called Balance, and using it to tell his story point. I mean, it makes you feel balanced in the shot, and maybe that's the point of it. Depending on what the character is feeling, you want to convey that emotion through the visuals to your audience. So in this case, completely broken the rule. To some extent, so is this one. Again, so these aren't cold, hard rules to follow, and you can never break them. If used properly and creatively, you can. And these are 2 or 3 masters that have to tell their story. So let's take a look. Radiating Lines, pretty simple again. Here's some examples from that book we talked about in last episode, the Edgar Payne composition and oil painting. And here's a couple examples of using radiating lines in his kind of storyboarding or thumbnailing. And here, you could take a look, just things kind of radiating towards the center. Now, it doesn't have to always be perspective lines. You can use things, an example. Now, in painting, in let's say concept painting, and like oil painting or whatever, you can kind of mold, as you look as clouds coming in. That may be a little harder to do in film because you're shooting on set, but as concept artists or your own kind of still life paintings or plein air paintings outside, you can have a focal point and have maybe clouds that can radiate lines to your focal point, or have things directing the attention of the viewer straight in. So don't think of it as pure and simple, perspective lines or trees coming straight in or power lines or whatever. There are creative ways you can use it to direct attention. You can see the clouds being used in this instance, kind of the terrain or dirt or whatever in this storyboarding moment that he's used also works. You can see. So try to think of it creatively. Here is and these are literal. This is a hallway, so you're gonna get perspective lines regardless. But to tell your story of hero character entering this hotel room, could be possible danger. This is the type of shot that the directors used. Again, in this instance, the character's walking down, lonely. What kind of feeling is he feeling? Is it balanced? Is it unbalanced? Using the perspective lines to tell a story as our character heads into the road. So Edgar Payne, how he used it in his, again, having this being your focal point, being the biggest shape right in frame, having lines radiate to it can be used even, straight through, creating that line with elements in your painting. This is less literal than both of these two examples and this simple one, more along the lines of what he's storyboarded in these little thumbnails. Another example of using radiating lines to bring our focal area down to here. All kind of different examples of how to use it creatively. Now let's take a look at another design called the S. Now this one again is pretty standard, used everywhere. You've seen it a million times. And it's just a shape that guides you through the frame, takes you back, adds a lot of depth. And it's a pretty literal kind of visual cue straight to your focal area, right? Because you have lines directing you straight to it while creating depth. So it's kind of cool to use, and you can mix it with other ones, as we'll take a look at. So in the examples, it's usually obviously someone traveling on a road of some kind or a path. So that's usually the examples you get, and this is exactly it. We have obviously our travelers going into these houses here, and of course this is the end destination, and we have our eyes kind of have to follow where the characters are going and kind of look at the final resting place. Same thing here. And one thing you want to avoid is having your S's start right from the corner of the frame. Kind of push it a little off or up. Don't start it right from the corner. Just an odd thing to do. So here's another example, kind of the same area but in the summertime, and kind of creates a lot of depth while telling the story of location and the character traveling now to, I believe goes further down into that frame, but leaving his loved ones to seek something else, as you'll find out when you when you see the movie. But another example. But you can see there's also, it's not just a plain like what I did here. This is the super simple breakdown of it, but there's always something else in the frame to kind of breaking it up and adding interest. It's never just a literal S and going up. So don't take it literally. Here's a simple, very simple, maybe even a radiating line too. If it wasn't, if you have to move, kind of like that to be an S, but kind of similar to a radiating line, you can kind of use it as a pathway too, exactly how these are used. And to show desolation, this is a super simple composition for a simple reason of telling that story of loneliness, cold, desperate times. So keeping your composition simple like this is telling a story. It's like, you don't have to add a shit ton of stuff in your frame to tell your story. It can be simple to drive that point home, create a mood. And David Lean's kind of known for these epic, simple compositions in this film and Lawrence of Arabia. Let's see how Edgar Payne uses it. You can see again kind of a pathway into maybe a focal area, a beautiful countryside or something. Kind of draw the eye in, create depth, and have a final resting place in this beautiful area. Can be closer to a pathway of some kind, as we saw with the horse. This could kind of be used as an S as well. So a combination of a few of these can create even more interesting compositions. Maybe something super simple can be combined with other ones. In this instance, we have the S, but we also have kind of a steel yard happening back here as well that we took a look at. Big shape balanced by small shape. So a combination of the two. Same thing here, using the big shape versus a small shape, creating more interesting compositions by sometimes combining it, if it serves the purpose of your story. in this master example, again, you're kind of using that S to bring your focal point to our traveler and combining it with what we talked about last week, an L composition to bring our eye straight down, and then balancing it off with another shape back there. So using all of these in combination with each other can be pretty powerful. Let's take a look at another one. And we're kind of going through these quickly, and just to give you an idea, this is kind of a quick overview. I want you guys to take a look at these films, find examples, look at Payne's paintings, and look for other examples where you see that and see how he uses it creatively. So this is just to get it into your thought process, to say, oh, these kind of exist, and then being able to identify them and how they're used in combination with other ones to create interesting compositions is where the work comes in for you guys, and start to thumbnail, kind of like what he did here, to find beautiful, interesting compositions that tell your stories. So you can see I'm kind of going through these quickly, but they're made for you to go back to the drawing board and start thinking about them and finding them in beautiful films or paintings and identifying with them. All right, the next one we're looking at is horizontal versus vertical. Pretty simple idea, balancing shapes to create interesting compositions by using horizontals and verticals. Payne in his book calls this also the cross composition, because you kind of do get the cross somewhere along the way, as you can see, kind of there. But horizontal versus vertical works just as well. Let's take a look at how it was used. Dr. Zhivago here, beautiful composition of breaking up the space, again creating a story moment of kind of crossing over this frozen lake or river and getting over to the other side where a possible enemy is holding their position. But this balance of shape, the horizontal versus the vertical, makes it just a beautiful, interesting balance and pleasing to look at. Another element that we'll take a look at is using shadows as a compositional element in a later episode, but you can see even in this instance, light is used as that horizontal element as well as shadows. The shadows are going horizontally along the plane, and so, I mean, if this was entirely in shadow, you can use this as Payne did here in his example, as another horizontal plane and having light. And if this was another example, you could put dark again and use that as your horizontal versus vertical with trees and stuff, whatever you want to put in there. But a good example of balancing those shapes out. Simple example from No Country for Old Men, of course, horizontal versus the vertical. Simple, clean, but this is again a story moment where we talked about last week. There's a dead character there, and our hero character walks in, as we saw last week, of using the L composition on how to frame it. But a nice balance of horizontal versus vertical. In our simple example, again, kind of similar to this one, horizontal trees, doesn't even have to be on the same plane, as you can see, kind of broken up, which is a good thing to do. Also, don't keep everything. I've seen a lot of paintings that go, straight. Everything's just off frame. Try to think of it in terms of depth. Create more interest. Layer them up. Maybe two start there and one's further back, one's in. Just creating a breakup and making your frame a little bit more interesting instead of having everything kind of lined up, on the same plane. Here's Payne's examples, his thumbnails. Using radiating lines doesn't always have, horizontal versus verticals, doesn't always have to be straight. You can have the sails of a boat against the wooden part of the boat as well, and having the horizon against the vertical sails. In this example again, we have the same thing, kind of trees against maybe light shapes or shadow shapes on the ground, as well as that horizon line. Here you can see kind of a similar thing that he did, using this as a horizontal. You can see also the horizontal, we're talking about shadows versus the verticals of the trees going all the way back. Beautiful balance of breaking up your canvas using this technique. Same thing, same example, shadow shapes, light shapes, creating horizontals as well as the ground, and then the verticals of the trees. Let's take a look at another one here. The balance. So this is an interesting one because it can be kind of misinterpreted as balancing out exactly the same shapes on both sides. And now the way I like to think about this is, and it's more of like a feeling, and if you're ever a kid and you're on a playground, they had a seesaw, right? And the seesaw, you and your buddy would get on one side, another on another, and depending on weight, if your friend was heavier, you'd get a teetering effect, or you can kind of bounce off the ground too to create, go back and forth, back and forth. And this is kind of the same thing. I like to think of it as a balance. If your frame has the same mass, if you and your friend were the exact same weight, this probably wouldn't go anywhere without some kind of force pushing off the ground to create that, to create the teetering effect. And the same thing in a frame, you have the same balance of shape. And you can kind of feel it if one feels heavier than the other, kind of throwing your composition off. What I like to do sometimes is flip the canvas. You'll get an idea of an imbalanced composition. If one side feels heavier than the other, usually is a good way to refresh your eye. But here's an example of framing from No Country for Old Men, using both sides of the hills, kind of balancing it. This kind of worked out for him. Of course, this is shot. So they probably looked for this location to frame it beautifully like this. And then you have your radiating line combination to take you into the frame and create depth. But because, and we'll take a look at some example, we'll go and break it down a little bit further. So the simple example, balancing your weight. So if this is balanced, doesn't have to be on the exact focal plane like these guys are in the exact kind of depth. They're in the same position. It doesn't have to be that way. You can have a balanced frame by having this shape way far back in the distance. Where it starts to become unbalanced is when one shape starts to overtake the other. Now if I push this around, you can see now it's heavily weighted on this side and not so much. It still works as a composition because we have different contrasts, but it's not a perfect balance because this shape is dominating the frame. Another good thing to think about also when you're doing this is not having the exact same shape, like on both sides. Even in this example, we have, if you were to break this up into shapes, it's similar, but an interesting thing we can do is actually break it up by adding interest to it, and you can see that's what this bush is doing. Now the shape, it's not big enough to throw off the balance, but it creates an interesting silhouette just by breaking that shape up. And we'll talk about creating interest in it in another later episode, but it's something you should think about. Don't take it literally where the shapes have to be exactly the same size. Now I've made it pretty simple and obvious in this one, but we can easily break this shape up without creating interesting shapes without throwing off the balance. They still kind of think, but now we have more interest because of the added breaking of the silhouette, making interesting shapes. So something else to think about. Let's take a look at some examples from pain. Here is a balanced composition. The mass on both sides feel balanced. We have a foreground area here with trees, but is balanced by another area further down in the distance of another mass balancing those shapes out, and kind of going all the way across, kind of balancing shapes. Here's another example. If you cut this in half, even the clouds in the sky are balanced, the shapes. Bigger shape, and if you combine that, that shape is also balanced on both sides. If we group this foreground shape, we have something else of equal balance or equal mass on the other side to help balance it perfectly. So don't take it literally, you know, having the two shapes exactly on both sides in the same focal area. You can see he's distributed the masses throughout the canvas while balancing the frame, and that's kind of how this works. Here's an example from his work. Again, two shapes. This is similar to this one where we looked at, where they're kind of the same depth on the canvas, but two masses balanced, and that kind of creates a nice V as well composition. Here's another frame kind of similar to this one that he's drawn. We balance it and kind of squint our eyes. We can see the dark shapes being balanced on both sides, and the mountain as well. It doesn't have to be, you know, equal breakup and have the exact same negative shape of the mountain, but keeping the masses of equal weight. And here's an example of where he's thrown it one way on purpose. So if we break this frame up, you can see it's heavily weighted on this side. If we were to do the teetering, and this was a balanced scale, we are definitely on this end. Heavy on this side and light on the other. But what he has done is balanced, or kind of created an interesting composition by adding a small shape here to stop your eye from drifting off the canvas while showing the beautiful landscapes that he's painting. So that's an example of not really in perfect balance, but still beautiful composition, because he's used this small element and kind of a version of the steel here, right? Big shape versus small shape off frame to hold that there. If this shape wasn't there, then our eye would literally follow these lines right off the canvas and not really focus on our focal area. And he's used the S in this instance to bring our eye here, masked the big shape on this area, so we're looking, our eye is kept on this part of the frame, and the radiating lines and the S keep our eye right here where it needs to be, and kind of this brings our eye back into the frame. So you can see why combining all the different compositional designs, or a combination of a few or a couple, can create more interesting paintings, frames, photographs, however you want to use them, because they apply to any medium really, whether you're shooting film, photography, concept painting, oil painting, plein air painting. You know, sometimes when you're standing out there in plein air painting, you may not get exactly what you want, so you kind of have to use your creative license and organize the shapes and design the shapes to make your composition stronger and your painting stronger. So a few 4 different examples again of different design motifs. There's a few more we'll cover before we jump into something else, but these are also great combination with them both. Practice these, block in shapes, look at films, see where they're being used, sketch them out, thumbnail them out, simple shapes, and see how you can creatively use a combination of the both combination of them all to create more interesting compositions. All right, we'll see you in the next